Welcome, and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. This month is celebration of Black History Month and the way that America was shaped by the hands of such that were able to make the spirit of America become indomitable. But sometimes there are certain things in the history of America and its shape that we just sometimes don't really realize how important it is. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program is best-selling author of Walking the Bible and also Abraham. He's also been featured on NPR, CNN, and Fox News. And he's joining us today on his new book, best-selling, America's Prophet, Moses and the American Story. And I'd like to welcome to our program today our guest, Mr. Bruce Feiler. Bruce, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you again.
Now, it's interesting, Moses. You just wouldn't even think about him being America's prophet, but as you
Where'd you learn your history?
Exactly. Now, let's talk about what you discovered here, because this is really some fascinating stuff here that Moses, of all people, would be considered to be America's prophet.
Well, let's just go back in the story for a second. You mentioned Walking the Bible and Abraham, and of course we've chatted about those in the past, and I had spent 10 years retracing the Bible through the desert for a number of books, and had been in the Middle East during a time when the kind of relationship between politics and religion and geography seemed to be the dominant issue of our time. I was starting to spend time closer to home. My wife had given birth to identical twin daughters, and we began traveling, kind of going out to the grandmothers, seeking help with our newborns. And I kind of just stumbled on this story. We went to Plymouth, and there's this recreation of the Mayflower, and I got on board. There was this pilgrim reenactor. He was reading the Bible, and I was like, well, I'm the Bible guy. What are you reading? And he said, the Exodus. We read it when we were on the Atlantic. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Here's Moses in the middle of Thanksgiving. In my childhood home of Savannah, there's a letter in the synagogue. There's a letter from George Washington in which he compares his success in the Revolution to the same God who freed the Israelites from Egypt. That's interesting. Here's Moses in the middle of the Revolution. Mm-hmm. There's a quote from Moses on the Liberty Bell, which I discovered on this visit to Philadelphia, proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. And I just kept finding this story, Ben Franklin recruiting Moses to pass the Constitution. You mentioned Black History Month. Harriet Tubman calling herself the Moses of her people. Martin Luther King, of course, the night before he died, comparing himself to Moses. The Statue of Liberty modeled on Moses. And I just thought, wow, this is a fantastically interesting story that I had really no idea about. Mm-hmm. For 400 years, one figure is the surprising symbol of America. One figure has inspired more Americans. His name is Moses, and I decided to go out and tell this basically untold story.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's fascinating, too, Bruce, about this is, as you talk about his story in the book, is that here is the attitude of that God has bestowed for him to bring these people out for freedom, okay? Mm-hmm. But it was an unknown journey, one that you just had to have faith to be able to say, well, I'm going to listen to God. But then Moses was put through what you would call 3 types of tests. Could you describe that for our audience?
Well, basically, Moses does face a series of choices in his life when the story takes place 3,200 years ago, 1,200 years before the birth of Jesus. The Israelites are enslaved. The Pharaoh orders the killing of all newborn males. Mother floats her son down the Nile. He's picked up by the daughter of the Pharaoh and raised in the palace. So he's raised in luxury. And yet he continues in his life to kind of align himself with the suffering against the powerful, both when he murders the overseer, flees to the desert. When God speaks to him in the burning bush and says, "Go back and free these people who've been enslaved for 400 years at this point." Later, when he brings down the 10 Commandments and the Israelites have built the golden calf, and God says, "Hey, Moses, these people don't appreciate me. I think we should go off and find us a new people." And Moses says, "Wait a minute." He placates God and he reprimands the people, and they form this this compromise, and they march off toward the promised land. And so sort of at time and again in his life, he aligns himself with the suffering who need to be free. And that's one of the reasons that he became such an icon in America, because imagine what's interesting is that, the Catholic Church for 1,000 years basically said you could only read the Bible in church, you could only read in Latin, the priest had to interpret it for you. it wasn't really until the Protestant Reformation where people had the Bible in their own vernacular, could read the story themselves. And imagine those pilgrims. They're in England, then they're in Holland. They feel oppressed. What do? They cross a tumultuous sea. They go to an untested wilderness. They set out to create a new promised land. The parallels with Moses were very deep. So when they were on the Mayflower, they said, not since Moses crossed the Red Sea was there a more important journey. The first thing they did when they got to Cape Cod, get down on their knees, thank God for allowing them to cross their Red Sea. So the parallels were very deep, and really it was because of the pilgrims initially that the story of Moses became the story of America.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's also interesting, too, is that as you read this and you realize why Moses would be considered to be America's prophet is because in America, when most people think of the American dream, it's about getting in there, getting gritty, getting, tried and tested, working hard, having fortitude. And in the end, sure, you might realize some success, but it's the adversity that seems to be celebrated so much. So you can't ever have too much success, yet too much failure. There's sort of a balance between the two. And that's the true test of what the American experience was actually based on.
And I think what you're saying is really important, and that is that Moses, if you just jump to the Revolutionary period where Moses was such an important inspirational tool, I mean, just consider one powerful example. On July 4th, 1776, immediately after passing the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Congress asked three people, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, they'll tell you how important they thought it was, to come up with a seal for the new United States. And 6 weeks later, they made the recommendation, the seal of the new country should be Moses leading the Israelites across the Red Sea. These are three of the five drafters of the Declaration, three of the defining faces of the Revolution, and they thought Moses should be the face of the new United States. And I think that one of the reasons goes back to what you just were talking about, and that is Moses was a very important precedent. Okay, so you're an oppressed people, the Pilgrims, the colonists under Thomas Paine and Common Sense, called King George the Pharaoh, later the slaves in the South. You were in a very difficult situation. The superpower, the most dominant feature of the day, is oppressing you. Who is an example that you can get out of your dire straits and go to a better world? Answer, the Bible. The answer, the story of the Israelites. They were enslaved under the superpower of the day. That's Egypt. So Moses was an incredible precedent. And this was not, now we have a kind of distance from the Bible. Oh, it wasn't written by God. It was written by God-inspired humans. And there's some mythology there. And maybe, our modern-day science leads us to question some of the miracles. That's the kind of a phenomenon of the last 100 years. For most of American history, most Americans believed that the Bible was true and that it was the Word of God, and therefore it was a powerful precedent that allowed people to believe that God wanted free people to get out of slavery, out of oppression, out of a difficult circumstance, and create a better world.
Mm-hmm. Nothing like adversity to get people to be motivated, especially when they feel that they're in their own adversity, realizing, is there any way out of this, and to have a story of reference.
And I think that's right. And let's just move to the slaves, because you started by mentioning Black History Month. And, for the slaves across the South, they didn't get news, as one professor told me. They didn't get news from reading the newspaper. They got it from reading the Bible. And they found this a very inspiring idea. So the number one theme of slave spirituals was the Exodus, take back Pharaoh's army, I'm bound for the promised land. And the most famous slave spiritual of all, Go Down Moses, which was called the national anthem of slaves. And Harriet Tubman, so I was just mentioning her earlier, she was born in Maryland. She escaped to freedom along the Underground Railroad, and by following a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night, both of which Moses follows when he's leading the Israelites across the Red Sea. Then she makes anywhere from 1 to 2 dozen trips back into slavery and leads people to freedom, but she becomes so famous she has to adopt an alias, and she adopts the alias Moses. So white slave owners across the South were putting up all these posters that said, wanted Moses, dead or alive. So here we have the founders 50 years earlier, wanting Moses for the seal. Now in the South, they wanted him locked back in shackles. So the story has this amazing ability to reinvent itself for every generation of Americans.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's also fascinating is you think about our great leaders, and one that comes to mind here in America, considered to be one of the finest presidents that America's ever had, and that's Abraham Lincoln, and his greatest act being the Emancipation Proclamation. And you describe in your book in there that is the first time Lincoln's personal relationship with God appears to have crept into a decision-making. Talk about that.
Well, he did mention in a cabinet meeting that he had made a vow with God that if they won a particular battle, I believe it was Antietam, that he would free the slaves, and so he did, of course, then free the slaves. And it's a fascinating story. I'm sitting here today in Brooklyn talking to you, a few blocks from Plymouth Church, which was the church of Henry Ward Beecher, the brother of Harry Beecher Stowe. And when Lincoln was shot on a Friday, it was Good Friday, and then he died overnight on Saturday, and he was eulogized on Easter Sunday. The same day he was shot, Henry Ward Beecher was in Charleston giving a sermon at Fort Sumter to commemorate the 4-year anniversary. 4 years earlier, that had been where the war started. Beecher gave a sermon that Friday in which he compared the American flag, Old Glory, to Moses, saying the American flag had been sent into exile during the Civil War, but now we would be dedicating it just like Moses went into exile in the desert and then came back to free his people. That night, a few hours later, Lincoln went to Ford's Theater, was shot. He died, as I was mentioning, on Saturday. He was eulogized on Easter Sunday, and even though it was Easter, more of the sermons, 2/3 of the sermons on Lincoln's death, compared him to Moses because he had, as you mentioned, freed the slaves, but, like Moses, been stopped short of the promised land of victory, so that Moses died on Mount Nebo, and Lincoln died, of course, before the war was over. But the death of Lincoln actually kicked off the most famous connection between, and probably least known connection between Moses and America, and that is America lovers in France wanted to pay tribute to the dead and martyred president by building a Statue of Liberty. Frederick Bartholdi, the sculptor, picked a Roman goddess of freedom as his model, but he imported 2 symbols of Moses to bring her to life, the spikes around her head and the tablet in her arms, both of which come from the moment Moses comes down Sinai with the 10 Commandments. So here, just like the pilgrims floated into Plymouth Harbor comparing their journey to Moses, immigrants floated into New York Harbor and looked up and saw that symbol of the new promised land.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's really fascinating as you read through this book, America's Prophet, is that when you think about the stories of Moses and Jesus, Moses seems to be that one story that stays consistent, even if you put it into Hollywood films. You know,
right.
You got the 10 Commandments, that's pretty much it. Jesus has, well, about as many reenactments about who he was and what he did as there is as well. So you kind of wonder, okay, so which one would be the true leader, so to speak? And you take a look at the journey that Moses went on, and his seemed to be one of the most arduous, whereas when you take a look at the story of Jesus, for instance, there's 40 whole years of his life that just disappear that are not even in the Bible. So you kind of wonder, okay, which one should we kind of believe in or follow or be inspired by? And that's what's really interesting about this is when you talk about the story of Moses is here he went through all of this adversity to be able to allow people to have choices. And yet once he gets to the door of the promised land, God says, oh, forget about it. So you kind of wonder, okay, which way should I lean here?
To me, it's a fascinating question. It's not one that I would have thought to ask at the beginning of my journey, but it really kind of took over my journey to a certain degree. I think, of course, Jesus is important to America in life. America was essentially 100% Christian at its founding and is 80% Christian today. But if you actually look, the themes of Jesus' life, poverty, alleviation, building a kingdom of heaven, and these kinds of personal transformations, spreading the gospel, these are really more important to the private lives of Americans, I would suggest, whereas the themes of Moses' life, taking an oppressed people, building them into a nation of laws, stopping short of the promised land, fighting oppression, these are really the great public themes of American life. And I think for that reason, it's not surprising that Jesus is present all through American history, but it really is, I'd say, surprising that Moses is there all the way up into the current day. And so, therefore, all the way up to Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush told me personally in the Oval Office he was inspired to run for the White House by a sermon about Moses that he heard at his second inauguration in Texas. Barack Obama saying that the civil rights generation was the Moses generation, but there still needed to be a Joshua to get us across the river into the Promised Land. He'd be the leader of the Joshua generation. Time and again, this story, there are 6 representations of Moses on the building of the U.S. Supreme Court. There's a Moses in the House chamber in Washington, D.C. that the president looks at when he gives the State of the Union. So he's almost like the patron saint of American politics. And I think that's what's just such a surprising thing, and why I called my book America's Prophet, Moses and the American Story, because I do think for the public American narrative, Moses is really the defining figure. He is our true founding father.
Well, it must be when you have people such as John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson proposing that he becomes America's seal.
I mean, it's again amazing, little-known story. But what's interesting is you mentioned the DeMille book, and I went, as you know, into DeMille's private garage and was given access that no one's ever had before, and read his private notes. And at the very end, and he basically DeMille turned Moses into an icon for the Cold War, so that the last plague with the green fog was meant to be like a stand-in for nuclear war. This was the duck and cover age, and he cast Americans as the Israelites and Europeans, for the most part, as the Egyptians. And the very end of the movie, Charlton Heston climbs to the top of Mount Nebo, hands over the Book of Life to Joshua, his successor, quotes the Liberty Bell, proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, even though that quote comes from the book of Leviticus, 3 books earlier, nowhere near where Moses dies in the Bible in Deuteronomy. Then he climbs to the top of the mountain, turns, and recreates the pose of the Statue of Liberty. This was all very intentional. It was in DeMille's notes. He walks Moses through the great icons of America until he becomes a symbol of America enlightening the world.
Fascinating stuff. And when you talk about, too, the adversity, especially when it comes to the book of Moses, there's a section in your book, I believe it was the chapter, The War Between the Moseses, where there was a doctrine of an opponent when it was coming to people running against each other, a slavery movement. And he said, quoting, Mosaic practice to support it is dreadful perversion. Now, it's interesting how you would have people dealing with interpretation, because as you were talking about earlier in the book, America's Prophet, is that people who fled England wanted to get away from, not from the fact that they were getting away from being oppressed, in so much as that they wanted to have the freedom to go back to read the Bible, because for many years it was the church that was actually telling these people, this is what the Bible is, this is what the story is all about, and this is the way we're going to tell it to you. And in fact, even owning a copy of the Bible or even reading from it, other than allowing the church to do that, could mean death. And it was interesting that you would flee a country just so you could go back to the Bible and understand it for yourself.
Well, the Bible was such a central part of identity for so many people, and in some ways it was what was the Reformation, and one of the central ideas behind it was giving people access to the text that the church was resisting in a lot of ways for lots of different reasons. And I think what you say is interesting, because it's not just a freedom story, because yes, Moses represents the great champion of freedom, and he wants to get people out of oppression, but he also wants to give them law. I mean, there is this kind of great period of tension in the biblical story. They cross the Red Sea, a period of lawlessness, then they bring down the 10 Commandments. The message is that freedom depends on law. And the same thing happened in America. There was a period of great freedom after the Revolution, then followed by lawlessness. Then they had a period of sort of re-enslavement, if you will, where they went and created the Constitution, which was a stricter law. And in both cases, one person prevailed. So just as Moses had freed the Israelites, then brought down the commandments, George Washington, who led the Americans in the Revolution, then presided over the Constitutional Convention. And this analogy wasn't lost. And when Washington died himself in December 1799, 2/3 of the sermons compared him to Moses, the first conductor of the Israelite nation with the father and first leader of the American nation. So this tension between freedom and law, same thing we see in the Statue of Liberty. There's the broken shackles at her feet that you never see unless you're looking down from above, the freedom, but then there's the tablet in her arms. It represents that tension between freedom and law, which has been sort of at the heart of the American experiment.
Now, taking a look today, it's interesting that Barack Obama had placed himself in the Mosaic tradition, as you proclaim here, and that it's the quote that was interesting that you use in the book is that we're in the presence of a lot of Moseses. What does that mean exactly?
Well, what he was referring to in that moment in Selma, Alabama, was that he was in the presence of a lot of members of the civil rights generation. But I think that today, what you see is, a kind of, we're in troubled times in America when Americans are asking, who are we, what do we stand for, and what is our place in the world. And when you go back and you look, as I have done the last few years, at every troubled time, people have gone back to the story of Moses. And so, to me, this story, as I mentioned at the outset, corresponded with the early years of my daughter's lives. And so what would I tell them as the themes of Moses? I would say it's imagine your own promised land, plunge through those waters, but don't be surprised if in the end you fall short, because the ultimate lesson of the story is that the dream does not die with the dreamer, and the ultimate destination of a story of hope, and there is no greater story of hope than the story of Moses, is that the true destination isn't this year at all. Really, it's next year.
Mm-hmm. And that's what makes this so fascinating as you read through this book. It's not just because it's a biblical story about somebody who existed at one particular time, but how it carries through with that dream. And I brought Barack Obama up because I found it was really an interesting parallel to draw him in a time that he was elected in an unprecedented victory, first time that a black person was elected president of the United States. So people had a lot of hope. So you can imagine what it must have been like for the Israelites then being freed from Egypt, feeling excited that there were now new possibilities for them to be able to take their own destiny into their own hands by a leader that was powerful enough to make them believe that that was possible. Here we are a year later, America's becoming cynical again because they're not seeing the change they thought would be so eminently immediate as they believed it would be, and now they're losing hope and they're kind of looking around, now what do we do? Moses was dealing with this for years.
To me, this is like the real story. I had a piece in Time Magazine a few months ago on what Obama can learn from Moses, and this was my point. It's like he wanted to be the Joshua to lead us into the Promised Land. He wanted to say, "Oh, King and those people were the Moses generation, and I'm the one who's going to finally take us there." Well, guess what? A year into your presidency, you're facing an entrenched pharaonic establishment on one hand, and stiff-necked followers. Rebellions from your own stiff-necked followers on the other hand. Well, guess what? You're not Joshua. You're Moses all over again. And the story prevails because you know what? It's like you don't cross the Red Sea and get into the Promised Land. Like, let's remember our Bible here, Mr. President. Right. You cross the Red Sea, at which point you have 40 years in the desert. So the story,
or Wall Street, for that matter.
Why does the story come up? The Pilgrims, the Founding Fathers, the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, 2010, because it's the cyclical story that it's this cycle of hope, struggle, disappointment, renewal, hope, struggle, disappointment, renewal. That's why the story continues to reinvent itself, because you always need another Moses. Every generation needs its Moses because every generation has its hardships. And the story is so elastic, which is why it's become so central to America.
Now, what's really fascinating is what you talk about when you come to visiting and knowing more about the Liberty Bell itself. And as I was reading that, it was almost eerie what you were presenting there, but it was so fascinating. I thought, they didn't teach us this in school.
Yes. Well, I think that they certainly don't teach us this in school, and there is a quote from Leviticus 25 on the Liberty Bell, which comes from a passage, and this is what I think that's so wonderful about it. It comes from a passage in Leviticus is like the least loved book of the Bible, right? It's a lot of filibuster, it's tedious legislation, it's very little read and very little loved. But this passage is a beautiful passage called the Holiness Code, in which it's about uplift the stranger, take the hurting into your arms, and reduce the suffering of those around you. And it was put there probably because it was the 50th anniversary. This is the origin of the term Jubilee, that every 7 years you let the land lay fallow. Every 7 sets of 7 years, on 49, you have additional Sabbath called the Jubilee. So this was probably the 50th anniversary of Pennsylvania, but it became a symbol of kind of America's higher calling, and that is that we are meant to protect those around us who are more needy and who need our help. And I think that's why the slaves went back to it. That's why suffragettes went back to it. My gosh, 100 years ago, suffragettes took the Liberty Bell on 11 different train rides around America and said, "Not until women get the vote will we ring the bell," even though the bell didn't ring anyway at that point because it was cracked. Mm-hmm. Later, Martin Luther King came there. Nelson Mandela came there, so it became a symbol of civil rights. And so every generation has used it because at its heart are these mosaic words on its side which say, this is our higher calling, this is our true purpose.
Mm-hmm. It's really funny, too, because when you take a look at the American dream, most people equate it with, material success and status. And the truth is that the American spirit and the American dream is about being able to prevail through adversity, to be successful, to be able to inspire others to be the same. And it seems that we're in a day and an age where people just kind of forget about those kind of values, and that things are just supposed to come easy without much strife, struggle, or even character building. But true character is really molded through adversity and what you do in it.
And certainly that story, it comes through in the biblical story, and it's why in times of trouble people tend to go back to some of these ancient sources of wisdom, because it does endure over the years, because it does speak to that struggle. The story begins, the beginning of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, it begins with the Israelites moaning under slavery, and God hears that voice, and God says that the entire frame of the narrative is about trying to relieve the suffering of these people. That becomes sort of the primal scream at the start of history, as one theologian I like calls it. And I think that's why when we hurt, when we suffer, when we wonder, when we fear, when we simply don't know what the future will bring, why this story comes back up, because it says, even in times of difficulty, there is an alternative. There is another way. There is a sense of hope. As Shimon Peres once said to me, the Egyptians build pyramids, and the Israelites build stories. And if anything, this story is about the power of story and its ability to renew people and get them thinking and moving forward.
Now, what's been the most exciting thing for you as you put out this book, America's Prophet, and how people have responded to it?
Well, I think that one of the exciting things about it is to see, and this was kind of one of my hopes, is to see how different groups have come to it. So the left has come to it. The right has come to it. This book has been embraced by the most liberal publications and writers and the most conservative talk radio and Fox News, as well as PBS and NPR, and liberal and conservative, Democrat and Republican. And I think that was one of the goals I had with this, was to show that this story transcends time, party, conflict, gender, race. It has inspired Republican and Democrat, left and right, men and women, black and white. And at a time when we wonder about is there a common identity anymore, or are we only locked in this kind of partisan battle that consumes us on a day-to-day basis? I think this story shows there are central values that link us, and what I've wanted to do, I mean, in some ways my book tries to ask a question. If Moses could split the Red Sea, could he unsplit America? Can recognizing the story give us a foundation, at least for a shared conversation? Doesn't mean we're always going to agree, but at least it shows us that there is a common thread that's united our history.
Fascinating work here. America's Prophet is the title of the book, Moses and the American Story, and our guest today, Bruce Feiler. Is there a website people can find out more about you as well as the book?
BruceFeiler.com, that's BRUCE, Feiler, F-E-I-L-E-R, BruceFeiler.com, and you can read about America's Prophet. I have a book coming out in a couple of months that's based on my own struggle with hardship. I've spent the last year
You're not going to talk about the circus again, are you?
I'm not going to talk about the circus, but I got those stories. They're just sitting in a bag here. I'm happy to unzip the bag. But no, I spent last year fighting cancer, which is my own sort of trial and circus, and have a book called The Council of Dads coming out in April about how when I first got diagnosed, at the end of this long journey, I reached out to 6 men and asked them to be present for my daughter's lives. And we've been talking about hardship, and I went through hardship, but what I found, as the story says, is the only way to come out of a difficult time is to look forward, to come together, and to be uplifted by community.
Bruce Feiler, fascinating book as Walking the Bible and Abraham was when we talked in those particular times there. Well, I want to thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to be with you, my friend.
Thank you very much. Again, the book is America's Prophet, Moses, and the American Story. Be sure to check it out at brucefeiler.com and pick up a copy as well as be inspired. We want to thank you for joining us here on the program. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That's the number 50 with a 50, and sign up for our free weekly e-newsletter. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. Remember, live your day past halfway.